Hi, my name is Jay and I make finance videos. Now the purpose of today's video is to highlight some very worrying comments that are coming out of China, and specifically the head of the Chinese National Bank right now. And I think it is very important that if you're an investor, if you're at all involved in investing at all, these are very important statements to hear and understand what they mean right now. So I will not attempt to pronounce his name because I can't. I have no idea how you pronounce that last name. But effectively, the head of the Chinese National Bank, who has held that position for the last 15 years, over the last month has made comments, fairly worrying comments, on 3 occasions about the stability of China's financial market and their stock market as well. He's made statements like sudden collapse in asset prices. What does that translate to? Effectively meaning there's a potential for a sudden stock market crash. And he has also described risks are accumulating, including some that are hidden, complex, sudden, contagious, and hazardous. Now, none of those words are things that I want my financial market to ever be described as. That is very, very, very worrying. Now, I do want to highlight that he has also said at this point in time, China's overall health is still good. But the fact that he is making these statements, and if you're at all familiar with Chinese culture or how China typically handles sort of negative news out of their country, they're very hush-hush typically. So the fact that the head of the Chinese National Bank is making these comments, and he's made comments like this multiple times, to me, and in my interpretation of this, he sees this as a very serious issue in China right now. And he's trying to put pressure on the government and on the financial sector to make changes fast. And he feels that changes need to be made fast, or else there will be a sudden collapse in asset prices. So my feeling and my interpretation is that he's making these comments because he is very worried about a potential market crash, which sends the whole world into a crash probably. And he feels that things need to happen soon. And very worrying as an investor. These are not good statements to be coming out of China. Now, one thing to note, China's government is actually very traditionally good at changing things fairly fast. They have the ability to actually solve problems pretty quickly with their government system, comparatively to something like America, who has a bureaucratic nightmare where they can't change things. China can. And the fact that he's making these statements, I personally view this as him trying to make China, or push China, put pressure on the Chinese government to make these changes. So that's at least one positive thing. Now, if you're at all familiar with the current economic climate, it's not good. And this is one of those instances where numbers, when it comes to finance, when it comes to economics, don't necessarily tell the full story of what's going on. Because if you looked at the Chinese stock market right now, things are going fantastically. It's reaching all-time highs. You looked at the American stock market right now, things are going great. You're making a ton of money. You look at financial news sites, Bitcoin is just reaching a new high. All of these things are fantastic. Well, when you look behind the scenes, it is not. Things are in the global economic state is not in a good place right now. There are massive amounts of debt, and when it comes to households, when it comes to corporations, when it comes to government, that have taken on way more debt than they can comfortably sustain. And that's an even bigger issue in China. Because what happens in China, they have very tight restrictions on the amount of foreign financing that can come in. So typically there's 2 types of financing. There's equity financing and debt financing. Equity financing is when someone pays you money, gives you money to sort of start a company, and in return they get shares or ownership in that company. China has very tight restrictions around that because they want to restrict how much foreign control can be had over companies in China. That means that a lot of Chinese companies turn to just financing through debt. And there's an even bigger debt crisis in China because they're taking on more debt to finance their expansions, their new companies. Another significant issue in China is zombie companies. And they are solving them, but they are still a massive issue, and they're slowly fixing it. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a zombie company is, effectively it's a company that cannot operate on its own. It requires government subsidies to stay afloat. So if the government weren't giving them money, weren't giving them funds to keep them alive, the company would go bankrupt and it would die. That's why it's called a zombie company. And China has a big issue with those right now. And based on all these things, China is in a very fragile and sort of on a knife's edge at this current time and place. And the reason I wanted to make this video is because the world is in a very precarious space as well. And if you're an investor, being cautious at this point in time, being diversified your investments, being safe is probably a very good idea at this point. And if you're an individual that's currently looking at this and saying, well, it doesn't affect me, I'm not invested in China. If China's stock market collapses, if they have a massive default, it's not going to hurt me. It will. Because if you look at 2008, it mostly centered or started with the American real estate market collapsing, and that affected the entire world. Same thing happens if China's stock market collapses. If their stock market falls off the face of the earth, you better believe the American stock market is going next, and Europe, and everybody, and it will be, if China falls, everybody falls. So, again, worrying statements. If you're investing in high-risk investments right now, if you have things in financial sectors, I would highly caution you and recommend taking a more cautious approach. You might lose out on some short-term gains, but right now the world is in a very precarious place economically, and being safe is probably not a bad idea at this point in time. And I just wanted to make this video because, again, these statements are very worrying, contagious, not a word you want to describe your financial sector. Hazardous, yeah, it's not good. That's all I'll say at this point in time. I hope you liked the video very much. Appreciate like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. And as always, have a great day.